You need to get out.
No, I don't.
You need to get out.
I actually don't.
All right. Hey, who wants to help me get this reporter out of here? I need some muscle over here.
Well, that clip from the professor, Melissa Click, has started a nationwide conversation. Eric Schmidt, Missouri State Senator, is here to join us. We'll get to Melissa Click in a moment. But first, Senator Schmidt, thanks for joining us here on the Big 550 KTRS.
Good to be here.
You are running for treasurer, is that correct?
That is correct.
All right, and you still sit on the Nurses for Newborns board?
That is correct.
All right, good. Before we get started with that Melissa Click story, you have a bill that is working its way through the Senate that is working with municipal fines. What's the latest with that bill?
Yeah, so, McGraw, I've been on the show. We've talked about this before. Last year we passed Senate Bill 5, which dramatically decreased the amount of revenue a city can rely on from traffic tickets and fines, because we saw cities, particularly in St. Louis County, that were viewing people nothing more than ATMs. It makes disincorporation an option if they go over that amount, and also cleaned up some practices in our municipal court. So it was sweeping reform. Since then, though, on this road to reform, we've seen some cities look for exit ramps, and Pagedale is an example. Pagedale is citing people for having a barbecue in your front yard with 3 or more people. That's not on a national holiday, which is illegal in Pagedale. It's illegal to walk on the left side of a crosswalk there. There's a lot of goofy things going on, but more and more cities we're seeing now are using those non-moving violations as a way to prop up their budgets. So we have a bill that was voted out of my committee unanimously last week that is on the Senate floor today, which would add to that calculation. We say that in St. Louis County you can't get more than 12.5% of your budget from traffic tickets and fines. We would add in those ordinance violations into that cap with the bill that is on the Senate floor today. So it's moving swiftly. It's more reform. It's a good thing to do, and I'm very hopeful for its passage.
Any opposition?
I don't. Well, the Municipal League opposes it, of course, which to me is ridiculous. They use taxpayer money to lobby against it, taxpayer money to sue on Senate Bill 5, and they're using taxpayer money now to oppose more reform. I think if more taxpayers were aware of what these taxpayer-funded organizations like the Municipal League was doing to work against them, more people would be up in arms. But that's really the only opposition.
All right, let's talk about Melissa Click. They brought charges against her. Is that right?
Yeah, she was charged with assault yesterday in Columbia for her actions that you played the clip of, and we'll see where that goes. But before those charges were filed, I and over 100 other legislators have called for her firing. I just think, McGraw, common sense has to play a little bit of a role here. You do not need to be a rocket scientist to figure out that the University of Missouri's reputation and credibility have been dinged by this incident. The idea that a professor of communications that had privileges with a world-renowned school of journalism in the town square, literally in the town square, was calling for muscle against a reporter, to have the reporter forcibly removed, the shutting down of, to me, a very clear demonstration of what the First Amendment really means, is just beyond reproach, it's beyond the pale. So all we're asking is for the university to pay more attention to taxpayers and to the greater good of the university and our state, and fire this woman, because it's ridiculous. But my concern is they're paying much more attention to the faculty and the deans and worried about the internal politics than the much bigger picture. The fact of the matter is over 50% of the faculty at the University of Missouri teach less than 2 classes a semester, okay? I filed for a bill that would call for an annual accounting of the system, just so we can just open up the books, see where everything's at. If there's improvements that can be made, we can see it. To also have for some curriculum transparency, so taxpayers can know what's actually being taught at the university. They oppose that. So we're going to have a long conversation this session about some reforms that can put the University of Missouri system on the right track, at least by way of perception. It can go a long way. I want the system to do well. I want Mizzou to do well, but firing her would go a long way in making a statement to Missourians and the rest of the world that this was a really bad incident, and they're taking corrective action.
Eric Schmidt, you sit as a Missouri State Senator. Do you think your body is somewhat hypocritical calling for her ouster and yet not banning journalists from the Senate floor and relegating them to the upper chambers and making the lobbyists closer to the elected officials as opposed to the journalists?
Oh, McGraw, you are a great journalist in and of yourself. I knew the question would come. Look, in Washington, D.C., and in the Missouri House right here, the press is not on the floor 10 feet away from senators, okay? The fact of the matter is it wasn't an effort to get rid of anything. They're still in the chamber. They still have free access to all of the debate. Interviewing senators, our office, my office, for example, is 10 feet across from the Senate chamber. We're very accessible. There's a space issue. There's not a lot of space for our staff, and this thing is kind of taking its life of its own. But really, we're using that table for our staff so that when we have research or we have amendments, we're much closer to our staff instead of leaving the chamber, going to the our offices and get that. So I think the press is still very accessible to the Senate. They can hear everything. They're right there. Interviews are still there. So I just don't think that. I think that's a criticism without merit.
Okay, so you're saying that the reporters have not been banned from the Senate floor?
No, they're not. No, I'm saying they're not on the Senate floor. They're in the Senate chamber. There's a difference. So
okay.
The chamber's not that big. They're still in the room. They're just not on the floor 10 feet away from senators. We're using that table where they were before for staff. And that's the only change.
So is it just as easy for them to get to you even after, a session? Can they just go to your office and interview you?
Yeah, the press, like for example, if there's a bill up or leadership will go, there's an area now with some refurbishments that have happened in the Senate that are on that same level that will go for press availability. And like I said, our offices are not like in a distant building away like in D.C. Our offices are literally kind of surround that Senate chamber. I'm on the third floor, the same floor as the Senate chamber. So we're very accessible. They're not been banished, as some people might think. I mean, they're literally in the room like they are in the Missouri House chamber. It's just we needed that space on the floor for staff.
Let me make sure I understand it so we're all on the same page. So
sure.
It's been reported that the Senate passed a law that prevents journalists from coming onto the Senate floor. You're saying that didn't happen?
No, okay. So it's hard to give a description of this. So the Senate floor is on one floor, and then we have a gallery above the Senate floor that surrounds the Senate floor, kind of like an arena.
Right.
So there are two tables on the Senate floor. So we have our 34 desks. There are only two tables on the Senate floor that around the dais, and we're using both of those tables now for staff. That one of those tables is where the press was. We, in a bipartisan way, voted as a Senate rule to have the press not on the Senate floor, but in that gallery now in the Senate chamber, exactly how they are in the Missouri House. So they have access. They're watching debate. They are still, in some instances, only feet away from us as this gallery area surrounds the Senate chamber. It's just not on the floor, like I said, 10 feet away from senators during debate. That is the only difference.
You should seen how hard I would have been if you weren't on the board at Nurses for Newborns.
Well, look, I understand that it's a very important aspect of the First Amendment. But there is no reasonable argument that can be made that they are somehow out of the loop now. They're just not on the actual floor where the senators are. They're they're in the upper gallery like they are in the House, and they're not on the floor. I don't know how many state capitals are on the actual Senate floor, but in Washington, D.C., it's no different. They still have access to debate. They still have access to senators for interviews. None of that changes.
Eric Schmidt, Missouri State Senator, you're always welcome here, sir.
Thank you, McGraw.
Have a good day. 727, Big 550, KTRS. We've got